My name is Shari Gearheard. I'm a research scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. I'm also a geographer. And for the last 15 years, I've been working with Inuit in Nunavut, Canada, documenting their knowledge of climate and climate change. And for the last 10 years, I've been working in the community of Clyde River on Baffin Island. And 5 years ago, I moved there with my husband, and we live there full time. My fascination with the Arctic really started when I was a little girl. Literally, I always loved the winter. I love the snow. I was addicted to National Geographic specials. I wanted to marry Jacques Cousteau. And I had an opportunity as an undergraduate to visit the Arctic for the first time. I was studying geography, and I was more into physical sciences, climatology, meteorology. And I went to a small Inuit community in Nunavut called Igloolik, and that was the first time I visited an Inuit community. And while I was working on my climate studies, we had an opportunity to meet some local people, and I was talking to them about my interest in climate and climate change. And so many people had a lot of knowledge about the climate and the changes that they were seeing. So I got really interested in that. When I went back to school, I tried to find information in the library about Inuit knowledge of climate change, and there wasn't any at that time in the early 90s. So I ended up doing a thesis on it as an undergraduate, and it just went from there. It really grew into more projects, different communities, and I've stayed with it ever since. And my focus now is trying to link the information that the Inuit have, the knowledge and skills that the Inuit have, with science. And that's been the focus for probably the last 5 to 7 years for me, and it's what I really enjoy, is being in the middle, trying to join different kinds of knowledge together. Well, when I first started, I had a hard time getting scientists to accept the idea of working with traditional knowledge on climate change issues. At the time, it was sort of a new thing, and it was hard to find information about it, like I said. So at first it was difficult to find those partnerships, but over the years it's been more and more accepted, and now I work with a lot of scientists who are really interested to hear the local perspective and try and see how local knowledge fits with scientific knowledge. Working with the scientists, one of the areas that's interesting when we bring science and traditional knowledge together is scale. Sea ice is a really good example of that. In science, we study sea ice mainly from satellite imagery, sometimes on the ice itself, but a lot of it is seeing how the extent of sea ice at its margins has been shrinking or growing in some areas. And contrast to that, we have the hunters who are on the ice all the time. They understand the ice and its changes at the very local scale and the regional scale. So those are really complementary ways of looking at the ice and being able to study it. So if we can bring the two scales together, we have a much more complete picture of how the ice is changing. Another example is I'm really interested in how weather patterns have changed. Again, in science, we have weather stations that are stationary, and they have not a great representation of the area, where we have experienced hunters who travel quite far, hundreds of kilometers, thousands of kilometers, through really complex terrain, and they've seen how the patterns are expected over time, what weather patterns are expected, and then how those patterns have changed. So we've been looking at the data that we're gathering at these weather stations, and then what the hunters have experienced in their travels. So there are different scales and different kinds of data that we can bring together that make a more complete picture of Arctic change. One isn't better than the other, it's just different ways of knowing. And like anything you're trying to understand, the more evidence you have, the more lines of evidence that you can bring together, the more complete the picture. How you understand the ice, or how you know the ice, has a lot to do with what it means to you. So what the sea ice means to a scientist is totally different from what it means to a hunter. So the ways that a scientist would think of how to observe the ice, how to study the ice, measure it, is different than someone who uses the ice, travels on it, depends on it for their livelihood. So the kinds of tests that each one would come up with are different. And for example, for scientists, something like thickness is very important. And that's also very important to hunters, but they have other things they look at, like the quality of the sea ice. And quality is a concept that doesn't really register with scientists because, well, what does that mean and how do you measure it? But for hunters, they talk about how the ice has changed in its texture. If you strike the ice with your harpoon, it's expected to sound a certain way or feel a certain way at certain times of the year. And when that changes, that gives you information about the characteristics of the ice. Perhaps what it means in terms of the breakup, if it might be breaking up fast or faster or not as fast this year because of that texture or quality that they feel. And those kinds of tests and understanding we just don't have in science, but they might have scientific relevance. So what's really exciting is to bring both sides together and try and understand what those are. And it works the other way as well. For example, hunters are very interested in learning to read satellite images, for example, and what they could do with the information they get from those images. So there's tools and tests and kinds of experiments on both sides that can be shared. I think the biggest lesson that I've learned, and I'm reminded of over and over again, that the impacts of the changes are so different from place to place. And a lot of times that message is lost, especially in the media. It's sort of the Arctic is warming, all the sea ice is shrinking, all the animals are in danger and the people are in danger, and it really depends on where you are. And in order for us to respond well to changes, we have to pay attention to what they are in different places. So for example, where we are, some of the changes aren't as dramatic. For example, in the Western Arctic, where in Alaska they're moving villages because of coastal erosion or seeing major changes in sea ice. Where we are, we do see changes, but they might be a little bit more subtle. And one example is changes in weather patterns. People like Ilku are expert weather forecasters, and they're having trouble making correct predictions these days. And they say it's because the weather patterns are changing. And that's something you can't capture for that dramatic news front page story, but it's something that's critical for travel and for having a good livelihood where we are. Yeah, we get asked that question a lot. Are we worried? And I've asked it myself to the people I work with in the community. And the community that I work in, the answer is always usually no. And the reason is because they've dealt with so much change, not only our climate change, but social change and cultural change, and they've remained so strong that there's a real belief that we're going to figure it out. And not only the people, but the animals. Everyone will say there's going to be changes, there's going to be losses. Some of the animals might suffer, decline in their population. The people are going to have trouble figuring things out, but they will figure it out. I think that the sense that I get is sometimes, again, from media, there's a sense of despair or hopelessness, and I think it's starting to wear a little bit on people that that's not the message they want to send, that there's a lot of skill, a lot of experience, there's so much change with people and wildlife that there will be something to figure out. As a scientist, though, I can see how in the long term, for example, if the ice really does continue to shrink, there's a real danger there. And that I think what we have to do about it is keep that spirit of hopefulness, that understanding that we have skills to get through it, but at the same time really try to understand the long-term implications and think about what resources we're going to need now and in the future to deal with those changes. And that's what our community is looking at as well. How can we plan for the change? And that's part of the resilience that I think the people have. Well, last year our community worked with Natural Resources Canada, which is a federal agency in Canada, and a group of planners to come up with a local strategy for coping with climate change. And there were a lot of things. We had community meetings and people came up with lists of things that they could do to deal with climate change. And there are many things from teaching youth some of the traditional skills. How do you study ice. How do you know what ice is safe and not safe? So really trying to train the youth with skills so that they can deal with the changes. There was things like buy more sunscreen. We've been having, problems with some skin irritations because of changes in the atmosphere. In our community, and again, it's important to highlight every community has its own resources that it depends on. So in our community, the main resource is seals, and for food, ring seals. And Ilku can talk, I think, quite eloquently about how the seals have changed in what we believe is a direct link to climate change, and specifically sea ice change. The sea ice, we've been having earlier breakup and later freeze up for about the last 7 years or so. We've lost 3 weeks of sea ice on either end of the season, and that's had an impact on the seals, in particular in their quality of their fur. And it's because during the springtime, the seals lay out on the ice in the sun, and they're molting during that period, and they depend on scratching off the old fur onto the sea ice. And because the ice is breaking up earlier, the seals are forced into the water before they've had a chance to get all that old fur off. And now in the summertime, the hunters are catching seals that are very blotchy, that have old fur still stuck on them. And that means that the skins can't really be used for clothing or other things that they usually would. So we're seeing some direct connections between changes in climate, changes in ice, changes in the animals, and then the impact on human use. I think people in Colorado, if they had an opportunity to visit the part of Baffin Island that we would live in, they would probably feel a real kinship there. We live in a really mountainous area. We ski, we have a lot of snow and glaciers, and we're seeing a lot of changes in those snow and glaciers, just like here in Colorado. Our glaciers are disappearing, and they're disappearing faster and faster over the years, like they are in a lot of parts of the world. All the glaciers in the world are changing. So imagine, being in Colorado and seeing the snow disappear and what that would feel like to your own identity, how it makes you feel about your place, about Colorado. So I think people in the Arctic are experiencing some of the same feelings. And I think there are parallels also talking about local knowledge. If you think about local experts in Colorado, Indigenous people could be one example, but also people like ski patrol. We have ski patrol who've been living and working in the snow and the mountains for decades, and there could be great links between scientists and ski patrol to study changes in snowpack, avalanche things, even weather patterns. So I think no matter where you are, you can look for local expertise that can be brought into science, and you could get some really unexpected results from it. We have to be really careful about how we talk about it. It's really important. The change is very serious, but at the same time, you have to remember there are people who live there and who are dealing with it and who have ways to deal with it. So there's a lot of resilience there too. So there's sort of a balance of, oh my gosh, it's so scary, all hope is lost, with, wow, this is really serious, what are we doing about it and what can we do about it? So more of a positive outlook on it, and I've learned that a lot from people in Clyde River, especially people like Ilku will say, we can learn to deal with it. We can think of things to do so that, we get through this together, and also learn from past experience and things like animals who have also been through crazy changes before. So it's a really fine balance of understanding that there is unprecedented change, unprecedented speed of the change, but that there is resilience there too. People in the north want people in the south to understand the dramatic changes that are happening in the Arctic are linked to life down here. And that life is based on choices, not only that individuals make, but that governments make. And I think the real example of that from the Inuit perspective comes from Inuit collectively, who have launched a lawsuit against the United States for the right to be cold, basically saying that, all of the changes we're seeing in the Arctic can be tied to pollution and choices that, in particular, the U.S. government has made, and that, people need to think about that and the impact they're having and take responsibility. That even though it's far away, it's having a huge impact on other families and other ways of life.